Hello everyone, I'm Nada Akari, the coordinator and event manager at the Art Circle. I would like to welcome you all tonight for our third webinar, the Art Circle at Home with, and our second episode of Al-Ula, the Hidden Gem. Al-Ula, for the ones who were not with us on our last webinar, is the first UNESCO World Heritage Site in Saudi Arabia due to its spectacular archaeological structures dating from the ancient times, ancient civilizations. Tonight we have with us five wonderful artists that I would like to present to you. Shireen Girgis, Manal Doyan, Muhannad Shono, Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim, and Nadim Karam. They have all taken part in the Al-Ula Desert X exhibition. It's the first site-specific exhibition of its kind in Al-Ula in Saudi Arabia that took place in Al-Ula in January 2020. They're going to be discussing with the process of the production of their site-specific artworks with Nadine Khalil. Nadine Khalil is the deputy editor at Canvas magazine. It's a Dubai-based contemporary art magazine. Nadine has been working for the past 2 decades in publishing, bridging her training in social sciences with cultural criticism. Before I leave the floor to Nadine, I would like to kindly remind you to keep the microphone on mute and mute. The conversation will last for 50 to 55 minutes, and it will be followed by a Q&A. So please feel free to send your questions on the chat, and Nadine will address it to the speakers in due time. Nadine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Nada. Thank you for your kind introduction. Thank you for having me and for inviting me here today. So we are talking about Desert X, which actually has its origins in Palm Springs, California. And it had a couple of editions before moving to an archaeological site in Saudi Arabia called Al-Ula. It's almost like an experiment to see what happens when a large-scale land art-inspired exhibition travels from one desert to another. So I'm very excited to discuss this today, especially as we're all in our closed spaces. It will be interesting to look back at what it was like to kind of look at site specificity in wide open space. So these images that you see here are just to give you an example of the different works that were present in Al-Ula, as well as the sense of magnitude of the place. It was organized by the Royal Commission there, as well as by the Saudi curators Renim Farsi and Alia Ali Reza, along with Neville Wakefield, who is also the artistic director for Desert X proper in California. So what I would like to speak to the artists today, and I'll be addressing my questions about their processes separately, is related to the idea of site specificity and what site specificity means today, especially when we consider that when land art started in the 1960s and 1970s, there was this idea that the work belonged to the space, it could not be moved. Whereas today we live in a very fluid environment where works are repurposed and kind of made in response to different spaces, and they do travel. In the case of the artists that we're speaking to today, these works were built specifically for Al-Ula, so they were for the environment, which makes them very interesting and at a time when, you know, the whole idea of site specificity is up in the air. So I'd like to start with Manal Al-Doyan, who is a Saudi Arabian contemporary artist currently based in Dubai. And Manal is interesting because mostly her work deals with the issue of visibility regarding gender and cultural change. So her work is very much linked to Saudi Arabia, I would say, especially in terms of cultural memory and women. But this was quite different in terms of the kind of work that she normally does. It really melded into the environment. And I think some people even said they could not see where the work began and where the environment began, you know, so it was kind of melding into the space. So these are examples of how she developed the work, which was called Now You See Me, Now You Don't. And basically it had very little interference with the environment. So it was a very soft approach. And so the first question that I have for, as you can see, these are trampolines. So the way that one would actually view the work, I mean, the way I saw the work was I saw people disappearing literally into the landscape as they jumped on these trampolines. I mean, they're more than just trampolines, because at night they light up because they reference water and lakes and the ephemeral nature of water that now is, due to environment change and climate change, is a pressing problem, especially in desert environments. So I guess the first question that I have that I think would be interesting to understand from Manal is, if you can, Manal, walk us through your work and just explain how you moved from the idea of the puddles, which were actual things that you saw in Al Ula when you would go to Al Ula during the winter or just after winter time. How did you move from the idea of these puddles, which everyone can see here lit up, to trampolines, to this idea of merging with the environment or disappearing into the landscape?
Thank you, everybody, for hosting us today. I'd like to speak on behalf of the artists without taking their consent, but I say thank you on behalf of all of us. Where to start, Nadine? So this project was a super special one for everybody, I think, because of, first of all, the location. The location is just a spiritual melting pot of cultures. So multiple kingdoms, almost 3 kingdoms, were built on top of each other in this area, in Al Ula. And there's a reason why these people decided to congregate and create kingdoms, and kingdoms that made a lot of money and were able to expand. It was the Nabateans, the Lahyans, and then the Dadans before them. And the main reason that these kingdoms flourished and existed at all was because they had access to fresh flowing water. This water actually created, Al Ula is till this day, but is diminishing, is a very agricultural focused community. They have farming lands, mostly palm trees, but when you walk around Al Ula, part of the sort of visiting culture of ours as tourists, city tourists, is to go to a farm and pick fruits and, you know, do these very unbelievable things that we thought never existed in Arabia, that we thought was a very desert landscape. Even if you look at the photo of my artwork, you don't see a single green thing, but this is a very rich sort of soil and rich environment for plants. Now, over the years, the environment, global warming especially, and on top of it, irresponsible irrigation use of underwater reserves by humans and men throughout the centuries has depleted the water supplies in Al Ula. And therefore, a lot of desertification is happening. There is, you can drive by certain farms and you see full palm groves dead because obviously they were drinking from whatever was under them and it depleted. Now that was sort of the trigger starting point, is to look at this environmental shift that Saudi Arabia has been addressing and thinking about for many years. Actually, I heard an interview recently where it was a sort of a socio-political thing about the Minister of Oil, our former Minister of Oil, Zaki Yamani, had once been interviewed, and this is at the peak of oil in Saudi Arabia, and they asked him, how does it feel to have this much oil? And he shrugged and he said, I wish we discovered water. And
that is so true. You know, they say the next wars are going to be over water, for sure. Scarce resource.
And this is something that we face in reality today in Saudi Arabia. And so it was sort of a precursor, even today, after this COVID pandemic that's taking over the world, it is very hard to go back to gender issues, as you mentioned, that most of my work addresses invisibility and disappearance of, or visibility, and the politics of visibility of the feminine body, face, voice, and presence. But I feel with this pandemic, we cannot ignore the environment, and is number one.
Yeah, let me add something here. I mean, it's true that your work is known for the gendered aspect, but you did come up with this desert rose sculptural form for 2139, and actually a lot of your work deals with collective memory in relation to geology, but it has been linked through the lineage of women. I do understand as a critic and as a writer that artists are often associated with one or two things, and that typifies their work. And it doesn't mean that, you know, you've not explored other things. But I think what interested me the most is that you were looking at the idea of visibility in a very ungendered way, really by just looking at it through pure environment and almost making your own work invisible in the space. Like there wasn't this sense, as political as it could be, there wasn't the same, you know, I really liked the way you worked with the space as land art, you know. I really liked the way you responded to that particular expanse that you were dealing with, and then you lit it up at night. So during the day it's invisible, and at night it becomes visible as water. But during the day, we won't necessarily think of it in relation to the aquifers that used to run through the place, for example. So my question was, how did that, how did that idea about the environment translate into the physical execution of the work? That's what interests me.
Well, it was quite a long process. I really didn't come up with the idea of trampolines as the first initial idea. There were other ideas that I tested and found that they might hurt the mountains around them, or that might create too much of a physical presence. I just couldn't compete with the landscape. I couldn't. Every time I tried to erect something, I couldn't put it there. And finally, when I did install this, up to the last day of installing, before you guys came for the opening inauguration, there was a lot of fear that, you know, somebody's gonna say, what did Manal do? Just drop some trampolines into the sand and she calls this art? And it was, I was, you know, really, hoping that the conceptual would come through, and it did. And I believe that, I think the landscape helped the artwork a lot. Sure. I think if I drop these trampolines in any garden or a space in Dubai, for example, I think it would be like, what did Manal do? Just drop some trampolines here and call it art. But this is sort of a new work for me, because a lot of my projects work with participatory. I have a very strong line of in my practice, which includes hundreds of women or participants to build artworks with me. And so there is always this interactivity, and I actually go towards that more than individual work where I work in my studio and present artworks in a very traditional sense. And this project really needed to have a participatory element. It needed to have a physicality to it. Your body was what you experienced the artwork with, nothing else. And the floating, the jumping, is very elevating. Your blood, the way it rushes through your body after a jump, you get off of the trampolines elated or relieved from something. There's this playfulness in childhood, revisiting childhood and sort of memories. But in reality, to tell you the truth, this artwork, the idea of it being a physical artwork, was in response to I've already been to Al Ula many times before coming to do this project. So I've been almost 14 times or something. I lost count. And I've met many people in the community, and I understand that in Al Ula, people have not seen museums, have not been and interacted with conceptual art or contemporary art in general. And I really felt guilty about creating something conceptual that excluded them. And I just felt it was a responsibility. Everybody can jump. Everybody can play.
I mean, that's almost anthropological. I just want to, because we have maybe limited time with each person, but I just want to conclude this small chapter by saying, in a way, Al Ula is so challenging because the landscape is the artwork. I mean, when you're dealing with such magnitude and such scale and such, it's sublime. It's really difficult to make a work that stands out. So I really like the way you then went the other way. And your work is, for me, was created when I saw people jumping and disappearing. I couldn't see them anymore. So they
It was activated.
Exactly. So without that, I mean, the work is made by the people who interact with it. In your case, as in Superflex, as in a couple of others, but with yours, it was quite dramatic. So I found that very interesting. But we'll have some more chance to discuss. I'm going to move on to Shireen Girgis now, who is an Egyptian, who's an artist of Egyptian origin based in LA. And Shireen's practice is research-based. It looks mostly at the politics of place, also marginalized histories of women, juxtaposing Western languages of minimalism with Eastern ornamentation. So there's that kind of, a multiplicity of influences in Shireen's work in relation to social structures and cultural identity. And Shireen's work was quite interesting because you could completely miss it. You had to find it, but when you did, then it was, it was really something that shone, literally. And, for me, what I found interesting about this work, which is called Khulkhal Alia, which Khulkhal is the reference to an anklet. And I mean, what I found really interesting, Shireen, about your work was looking at the story of this old Bedouin anklet that your mother had, creating a narrative around it, or imagining how it was passed down from generation to generation in a frame that basically combined the historical with the fictional, and then looking at poetry as a form of oral history and then inscribing a fragment on the ankle. So I found it quite interesting. And also to me, it looked very sci-fi, because if I didn't know that it was, if I hadn't read about it, then for me, it looked like part of a spaceship. So, but at the same time, it was not obtrusive, like it really fit into that gorge so snugly. And so I kind of want to ask you, what led you to the historical or the narrative around the actual object of material culture, which was the anklet, to create, a physical rendition in this form, and then the poetry as well. So how did you mix all this fact and fiction together? How did that process come about?
Thank you, Nadine, and it's really lovely to be here. I think I often do that. I left home, I left Egypt when I was around 14 years old. And I think that kind of existing within a diasporic environment has driven me often in my work to try to root myself in these multiple spaces in the US, in LA, in Cairo, in the desert, in the city. So I've always felt like that liminal space between where real memories and imagined memories and stories that my mother or my family would tell me, and things I read in history books. And a lot of the time, a lot of those things kind of can conflict or contradict themselves. And then how does one who's raised in this kind of diasporic and liminal space kind of weave a narrative, a historical narrative for themselves? And how do you, where are the places historically that you can find your own story that you can relate to? And so that's been kind of an umbrella idea for me, as far as just my practice in general. For this project, this project was kind of, a mystery initially. Neville called and like, you want to do this in this place in Saudi Arabia that none of us had been to. And so I really wanted to approach it with an open mind. We felt like we just got on a plane and, bam, we're there, things we don't get to do these days. But even just looking at it from the plane, and it was really clear to me. I think I understood immediately that this was going to be very different, and there's going to be a lot of different challenges to doing this project. And that landscape, as Manal pointed out, and anybody who's been there knows, it's magnificent, and there's nothing like it. It's not like any other desert. And so I really wanted to approach the site specificity with care, and allow my kind of experience and my site visit to dictate what was going to happen. I don't know why, but I happened to take this whole thing with me on this trip. And when we walked the site, and I don't know, I think it was like 2 PM, you know, we landed there, we found the site. It was this kind of surreal moment where we're just walking through the desert. I don't think I had water or a hat, and it was like 2 PM and then it was like, so and you're kind of half delirious, and we walked to this little gorge, and it was shady, and it was this incredible shelter. And so we sat down, and you had this incredible view of the entire valley kind of opened up to you, and it just felt like a reveal that could somewhat transcend space and time and history. And I sat there, and I immediately told Neville, this is going to be the place that I want to make my sculpture. And at the time, I had no idea what it was going to be, but I knew it was going to respond to this site. To try to figure out specifically what that was going to be took a little bit longer. What I was hoping to do was to make a piece that did not try to compete with the landscape, of course, because it's not possible to do that. Again, as Manal was saying, I think we all realized that immediately. But to be in conversation with it, to think about what it means to have shelter, to think about what it means to look down this valley, and kind of honor the history of that place, both as a site and a geological site, and also the cultures that have, and the people that live there and that have passed through that place. And so I was interested in having a conversation about migration, about history, about pilgrimage and going to these places. So in some ways, the piece was about, for me, it was a meditation on this particular site, its history, and both its kind of people's history, its cultural history. So I knew I wanted to find a poem of that place that speaks of that place, and talks about this specific desert. We tend to think of like, oh, desert here, desert there, you know, and they just like cities, they're completely different and unique. And so I wanted to make sure that my work still looked like my work, but engaged with Alula specifically, and the traditions and histories that have long been kind of maintained there and carried on there. So so I found, after a lot of research, and this often happens, is there's not a lot of written record of the narratives and stories in Bedouin cultures, in Egypt as well, and all over the Middle East, because a lot of that history is oral. And so I found 1 or 2 books. My Arabic is terrible, and so I had like a group of people helping me translate, until I found Alia's poem that was just beautiful, and it's a reminiscence of her life in the desert, her life as somebody who walked and moved through that space, and looking up at the moon and kind of remembering that. So it kind of all happens like a web of things. There's not one single point. So I happened to have the Khulkhal with me. I was looking at this poem. I just spent a lot of time sitting there, you know, just sitting in that space and thinking about what it means to have a shelter in the desert. The way we think about deserts as these harsh, empty environments, when in fact they can be the most, I don't know, nourishing of places. So I wanted to have a kind of piece that maybe embodied the experience of meditation. So so when I created the Khulkhal, I thought about 3 positions in which people can experience it, and which that would mimic kind of my experience of that spot, which is kind of walking towards it. Like you were saying, Nadine, it was almost, you don't really see it. It's a huge sculpture, and you can see in some of the fabrication photos, it's massive. But like it really kind of just tucks in, and it's a bit hidden, and it takes work for the viewer to walk through the sand, to get there, to find it. And that process of discovery for me is metaphorical in how we have to kind of find these narratives historically, and especially in the case of women's narratives, which are often not documented as well. Right. So this kind of looking inwards into the gorge, looking upwards, and at first it just looks like a black bar, you know, from far away. It just looks like this redacted piece of text, this space that you should not enter, right? It's like this black cross. Is unknown. And as you walk through and you walk under, it starts to reveal itself. Lights start to come through the light tunnels, and you start to experience this, for me at least, this joy and this excitement, hopefully. And then you turn around, you sit down right under it on a boulder, and you look out and you can read the poem as you're looking at this piece of desert and as you're looking at the valley. So this idea of in, up, and out, almost like a meditation or a kind of breathing sequence.
There's something I really like that you said on the Desert X podcast about the closing of the circle, how the person then, I mean, you know, it's quite poetic, your work. I mean, it's beyond, it kind of points to a constructedness that exists outside the work, which is why I just want to ask you one question now, before we move on. Does it matter, do you think it matters if the viewer recognizes what the object is or not? Like, does that actually matter? Or is it more about the unfolding or the different layers or the wondering? Because like I said, I would not have, maybe me and maybe others might have not actually immediately identified this as the precise object that it was modeled on, say, or as a Bedouin anklet, as all the different references that it carried. Does it matter what it is? Do you think?
I think at all levels, I like my work to have an element of discovery and interaction with its audience. So yes and no. I mean, yes, you can probably recognize at least there's a little bit of reference to a jewelry, to a crown, to a bracelet, you know, so all of those things start to come together, and the longer you sit with the work, the more you can discover, possibly. Does it matter that everybody gets it? No. Will somebody know that this is a hotel that my mom gave me? No. Some people can't even read the text, you know, and so that is part of the experience and the conversation I'm trying to have with my audience, which is there are these narratives that we have to work to read. You know, we have to actively give ourselves agency and give each other agency to find, to discover, and to interpret. And I think if it's too obvious and it's too literal, because we could have easily cast an aluminum that looked exactly like a hotel, that's not technically a problem. Mm-hmm. But what does that leave the audience to do? Look at a beautiful piece of jewelry, you know, that doesn't allow for the audience to complete the circle conceptually, right? To actually close it and say, oh, my story, my life experience has me interpreting this work in this way. And so the viewer really completes the narrative of the work, and it's different for each person. So I think that's just been my preference in my work in general.
And it's also a defining characteristic of site specificity. Site specificity and site-specific art is very much about how you feel around the artwork. You know, it's not the object for the object's sake. It's really about the whole atmosphere and what you create with the work by being there as a human. And, you know, I'm just thinking about all these things right now, because if we are prevented from interacting with space the way we used to, then what is to become of different sites in which artworks can be activated in the digital medium or elsewhere? But anyway, thank you very much, Shireen, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more to discuss soon. I want to move on to Muhannad Shono, who is a multidisciplinary artist based in Riyadh at the moment, originally Syrian, and was trained in architecture, though he told me today that he's never practiced, so I'm just going to add that. So Shono's work is very, very interesting. It's highly conceptual, highly monochrome, There's a level of mythology in it, ritual, religion. There are ideas around political censorship and just things that are unspoken. So I've found the work quite intriguing for a while, especially The Lost Path, because it reminded me of another work called Streams, Dreams, and Flow States, which was shown in Riyadh recently. Though I remember that work, I might be mistaken, Hannat, so please correct me if I'm wrong. I remember that that work had more of a sense of verticality. I think it was made up of similar materials, the polyethylene pipes, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. If this was somehow something that you've developed before that grew with this landscape, maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the use of the pipes was always intended to be site-specific and very responsive to any location or environment, much like a sculptural sketch, responding and weaving its way across this landscape, which to me was akin to a sheet of paper. And these PVC pipes, in their individual sense, might be something you might consider a throwaway, or something that we might neglect. But in number and with consideration, a line of ink or this sculptural object starts to hold within it narrative, stories, movement, wielding it in number to change the space around it. And as determined as this work was, one point that I kind of stumbled upon even so late after the exhibition in preparation to this webinar was the realization that even with this path, the sculptural path absent, the experience is still there. You can still walk this land, you can still find your way up to the end of the path. It is still available and exists, despite the work.
But that's in relation to the existential element of the work. If I understood correctly, The Lost Path is about a person on a journey, on a very solitary journey. This is what I understood. It starts with one single pipe, and then it grows, it aggregates. And you had mentioned in an interview also on the podcast that the intention was the sense that we are alone in a place without distractions, which is something we try to avoid today. And I found that very interesting. And I understand what you mean by movement, because you're just going to go with it, like if you go through the whole path. But at the same time, there's a sense that there's no precise destination, right? Because it forks, it diverges, right? Is there an ending point to the lost?
There's a metaphorical ending, but it starts off very single-minded, like a line or a rope pulling you towards the site. You can't actually see the installation from the main location of Desert X. It's a teaser that pulls you in. Now, if you choose to follow this call to adventure and you become the hero in your own story, then it's available for you. And you can choose how far do you want to go, how far do you want to follow this work. In the beginning, it's single-minded and sculptural, and at some point it becomes almost liquid, almost limitless possibilities of direction. Mm-hmm. At the end of this supposed installation or sculptural path, you find yourself alone with yourself in a very quiet, solitary spot, celebrating the location in you. It's up to you to choose if you want to make it that far. The journey is yours to take.
Right. And I want to ask you about the element of the monochrome that you're so interested in. And I liked how you were talking about ink and sketches, and there is this sense of things spilling forth. But what is the significance of the blackness, the whiteness, the very stark, in a way minimal, but in a way maximal aesthetic? I was just wondering if maybe you could say a couple of words about that.
This takes us back to the beginnings of things. So growing up in Saudi Arabia, redaction, censorship was a very heavy thing. If you were to draw a character with life, we were told to strike in school as kids. We were told to strike a line through the neck of these characters to decapitate them, to render them dead, because the act of creation was only bestowed upon a creator. So we were not allowed to create. As a young person who had created these characters and these worlds in his mind, this was a violent attack on my creative world. So I had to make a choice at a very young age. Do I want to continue as an artist, or do I want to feel guilty about creating? So the use of the line for me is very important, because I want to use a line to create rather than to decapitate. The black redaction, or the very visceral kind of ink, was something that we experienced in books and comic books. There was a lot of redaction of text. Now below this redaction existed a whole world. This actually inspired my creativity. So I wanted to fill the gap. So this was very important. This was inspiring. So I wanted to thank the restrictions, because they helped me focus into something that became what it is today.
I mean, there are a lot of theories about creativity in restricted conditions and, confinement in certain ways. So, we could really, really explore this endlessly. But I think, what I also find interesting about your work, beyond the fact that you use 65,000 pipes, and a lot of the images that Muhannad shared with me, I wasn't able to put everything on today, was the number of people who worked with you collectively to actually make this happen. It was like a whole force. But beyond that, I also wanted to, actually now I've forgotten what I wanted to mention. What was I going to say? Beyond that, I wanted to ask you about how did you stake out the territory? Because it feels so horizontal, like a flowing river. How did you map it out? Like, what was your process like?
I drove the curators insane, I think, because I would constantly resketch this location over and over again. And I think it was on the final visit that I really discovered this very quiet, solitary space at the end. And it's just kind of, the act of a single line not being a mistake. It was very important, so that you allow one single line to lead you to another single line, and you are simultaneously creating the work, but you're also on the adventure that you want people to experience. So actually, by the time you finish the work, the experience is over. So this was kind of very important to kind of respond to the site, to weave around the landscape, not fight it, and later found out that this actual path was where the stream of water would flow through the site in rainy season. So it was a happenstance, it was natural, and that's the way I wanted it to be.
Now I remembered what I wanted to ask you. Speaking, when we were talking about cultural identity in politics, especially with Manal and Shireen, where there's this very specific intention and how you want to position the work. What I found so interesting just recently, when I was listening to the podcast, was that every time I read about your work, these pipes are referring to the oil industry. But actually, that was not really an intention. It might have been a byproduct of the material that you use, but it's not you trying to comment on the economy of Saudi Arabia. And I just found it so interesting how narrative can kind of overtake the actual artist's intention, the narrative around the work by the media, or the way it's couched in the literature, and I found that so interesting. And then it just reminded me as a reviewer how it's so important to speak to the artists, like sometimes I review works without interviewing artists necessarily when I'm dealing with a large show or a group show or something, but we are always 2 steps away from the intention, because a lot of the work is about how you experience the work as a viewer. And so I was just really surprised, thanks to the Desert X podcast, for understanding that, sure, you're using materials that are then given back, but it wasn't necessarily about the oil, which is the way I interpreted your streams, dreams, and flows. Yeah.
That's good.
So anyway, moving on to Muhammad Ahmed Brahim. Hi, Muhammad. Muhammad, are you there? Is he there? Anyways, I think I saw, yeah. Muhammad Ahmed Brahim is one of the pioneering Emirati conceptual artists based in Khorfakan, which is between the Gulf. It's a beautiful, beautiful location between the Gulf of Oman and the Hajar Mountains. And that site actually inspires a lot of Muhammad's work. So I'm very happy that we have Muhammad here with us today because he is a land artist, you know, extraordinaire from the region, very close to home, to where we are today. And actually the landscape around where he lives inspires a lot of his work, including the work that was done in Al-Ula, as far as I understood. The first question I want to ask you, Muhammad, if you can just unmute yourself, is why you use the word garden. So your work is called The Falling Stones Garden. And I found the term garden very interesting, especially because we're dealing with large kind of circular, cylindrical looking rocks. So maybe if you can tell us something about that. Hamad, you need to unmute the, yes.
Yes, yes.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Nadine. I just now I get a problem with this
It's okay.
with this phone, but I did it. I repaired it. Anyway, thank you for inviting me for this chatting. Actually, it's the work in Al-Ula. First, I want to start to say I am dealing with land since a long time. So what I notice or what I get about the land, especially when you see Gaston Bachelard, what he said about the land. He said exactly the land or the space or the place. He have a memory and he have a feeling. He can. So in the first time I've been at Al-Ula location, yeah, in Al-Ula location, I said how I can make this friendship with this location. Really, I didn't take a lot of time to because this kind of location, kind of land, this nature, it's not easy to be or to have friendship with it in this very short time. For me, examples need years to make relationship with this kind of environment. Anyway, I took a lot of photographs. I print the images, and I hang it in my studio. So I start to make kind of dialogue, and I start to have a peaceful together. Then after that, when if you go, if you have a friendship with the land, then it can become, there is no secret together. You become a friend together. So
I love that. I love the idea of a friendship, of a camaraderie with the land, because I actually felt that they were, you know, like almost playthings, you know, things that you would interact with because they're very large. I don't know if everyone can tell the scale, but yeah, when you see this man, you can see they're very large and they just go up on an incline. But why did you call it garden?
Yeah, because I actually I did two proposals. One I called it oasis, and this I called it a garden, because this place, it's a garden already. Why I call it a garden? Because just I want to put to give attention, more attention for the people. They have to feel they are in the garden. It's not a desert. It's not just rocks. It's not. It's full of colors. If you go close to this rocks, you will see a lot of. Maybe I bring a few. I add a few additional color for it. But there is blue in these rocks. There is red. There is purple. I saw it in my bare eyes.
Yeah, so I was actually, that was my next question was going to be that. It's interesting because I read that you said that these were colors you actually saw in the landscape. But for me, when I first saw the work without speaking to you, I thought, oh, you know, Mohammed is commenting on the kind of spectrum between the natural and the artificial. You know, he's kind of creating these larger than life, but not as large as the rocks, obviously, in El Ala, but he's kind of showing another version of the natural and artificial color. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah,
I think what I want to ask you now is, can you tell us more about the materials that you use to make these rocks? What are they made out of?
yeah. Actually, this is it's made by fiberglass and colored by outdoors colors. It's done by manufacturers. I give him the proposal, the maquette for it, because actually I'm going to do it in natural things, but it's very, it's not difficult, but it's take a lot of time, and especially in this short time to do this. So I found it's easier this way and give the idea what I want to say it for that. So
your work has been moving towards a lot more color in the past few years.
Yeah.
A lot of like very intense color. Yeah, I've noticed.
Yeah. So this color is not strange for me. It's my color also. So that's why I bring my colors to give it as a gift to this location. To as example to want to get her friendship for this. And when I did this, I want the people also to deal with this with their body, with their hands. They can move in it, they can play with it, they can move it even, they can change it. So it's, they can play with it in the end. So it's...
it wasn't flexible, right? It wasn't soft, it was fiberglass.
Yeah, it's fiberglass, yeah.
Yeah, but it seemed like it was Play-Doh. Like I thought maybe this is, you know, a moldable, but it wasn't.
Yeah, you can move it, but for the safety, for a lot of many issues, there's not the time to explain it because a lot of things happen. So what I called it, when we called it Falling Stones Garden, because if you see in the top, especially in this, the top of this rocks, big rocks, it's coming from top to down. So this is the rocks, the place for these rocks from the top, from this area. So I want, this is, and nobody, can see it from the top. So that's why I feel it. This is coming down. This rocks coming from top to down to show themselves to the people, to the nature, to the location. So that's why I keep this to give them more attention for this small rocks falling down. Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move to Nadim Karam, but I'd like to ask everyone if you have specific questions for specific artists, it would be better to address them specifically because in 10 minutes we're going to move to the question and answer session. Nadim Karam,
thank you.
hi. Thank you, Mohammed. Nadim, last but not least, your work is extremely intriguing because you actually did research on the flora and fauna that's present in the region around the Arabian Peninsula. And so what I initially thought in your parade or procession was Fantastical Creatures was actually inspired from the actual, you know, living beings and matter that exist in this region. So just to introduce Nadim quickly, Nadim is an artist and an architect very well known for his large-scale urban art installations and influenced by Japanese theories of space, which came from a period of study in Japan, and is known for making dreams for cities around the world, and these large, playful urban art installations. So I guess the first question that I have is, so, you know, you've done creatures and processions on, for example, in Beirut on the Corniche. So what was different, and other places, obviously Melbourne and Tokyo and other places, what was different for you about the experience in creating these forms for Al Ula? If you could say a few words for that, on that.
Yes, definitely. Can you hear me first?
Yes.
Okay, good, good. First, I would like to thank all of you to be present and to have invited me to this. And I'm so happy to see the colleagues or the people who have collaborated, the artists who are also present there. We created kind of a family mood during that period, whoever we met and spent some time with. So it was really, you know, spending time in the desert and spending time with people you get to know as new artists and things is a fantastic thing. The difference between this and other works, I would say, first is the desert.
Yeah.
You know, there's this expand of a desert that I think the landscape that you have in Al Ula is such a unique and fantastic landscape that whatever you do, it kind of, you cannot beat it. Let's put it this way. It's very simple. You cannot beat the landscape that's in front of you. I mean, you say art, but the whole thing surrounding you is art. It's just those rocks that talks to you, that have an energy which is so strong that I felt that my work was coming out of the rocks themselves. I mean, these species just jumping here and there and creating by themselves the organic shapes that I have provided there, you know. So there is this specificity to the Al Ula that when you put something there, it has this poetic expression by being sand, rocks, and the work itself. Now, when it comes to the work, I would say that in order to, I feel the organic shapes that I've created were very much in tune with the rocks that were around them. But in order to be able to define the work, I created one sharp line. It's like you're cutting through the desert, you know? It's a cicatrice. You're just creating a wound in the desert, if you want, through these works that are organic, but it helps creating one simple geometry in the whole thing to read it in a clearer way. And of course, what will help this is a procession, like the caravan ones. I always looked at those caravan photos and it was kind of a nostalgic thing for me. So having this line there was a very important effect for me, with the background, with the desert, with the rocks. So in that sense, I can say that the organic part of this project, the elements that I have created, comes from those species that exist, are hidden within the rocks, around the rocks, and in such a desert context.
I mean, that's very interesting because, as we all know, I mean, the rock is almost, I mean, Al Ula is almost hallucinatory because you can see all these carvings in the rocks that appear like, you know, creatures, or, you know, but this is quite, you know, in a way there's a provocation here because you're talking about organic elements to it, but then you're using Corten steel. So, you know, it's an interesting kind of dichotomy, but I like the way you talked about the lines of sight, which we've discussed, because there really is that line of sight where, because of their compression, if you look in a certain way, they almost disappear. You know, it's almost like you've created it so it looks different depending on how you look. So it's very architectural, the way they were staged and the way they were formed. I found that probably the most remarkable thing around the work. It's not the pieces themselves, it's how you see them together in a line. Or a scar, as you put it. It creates a scar on the earth. Yeah, that's quite interesting. But so if we want to look at the material, how did you, I mean, I think you normally do use Corten, right? Steel for
yeah, I use it a lot. I use stainless steel and Corten, yes.
Yeah. So Yeah, I mean, you know, the organic element of it is much more in the movement of them together than the actual works themselves, which are very stiff and very hard, like steel.
You,
But
yeah.
my, but so how did you decide on the actual site? Like, how did that process happen?
First, let me tell you about the Corten, if something. The Corten, by using Corten, you give history to the work. The work by itself gets rusted and gets to a certain stage where it stays like that. So it's frozen forever. Although we're talking about a caravan which means movement. We're talking about a parade in celebration of those species that are there. So it's something that should in principle be in continuous movement. And what helps create this movement, as I said, is this linear line that makes the work like a clock, you know? So there is this time dial that exists there. And based on the shades or on the shadows created by the sun, you will have the movement of the work continuous during the whole day. And then you start from zero again for the second day, etc., etc. So in that sense, you have a linear thing that is of Corten because it creates the frozen part, the historical part of the site, which I think is very important. What Al Ula has been in the past and the revival that Al Ula is going through shows a lot to this region, and it's kind of I would say, a lucky thing or a blessing to be able to see that site and to be part of it. So in that sense, it's fantastic. Now, after the Corten, what was your other question? Sorry, I mean, just...
Yeah, it was about, I mean, you know, because you are trained as an architect. Sorry, I forgot to mention that Nadim Karam is Lebanese. I mentioned everyone else's nationality. I don't know why. Maybe because I'm Lebanese, but
yeah, probably.
like, okay.
Okay.
So, but what I wanted to know is, you know, I'm trying to look at your other hat because you are an architect, a practicing architect. So how does an artist who is also an architect delineate where the location is and then take the measurements?
Yeah.
Was it, you know, how did you know which flat area it would be, and how did you, you know, figure out this particular location that gave that plane, you know, because it's quite a feat.
You know, I mean, there was the first trip was to locate the work. First, we had to do proposals. I mean, the tendency was to go for circles, and I went for a linear thing because after I explained the meaning of the whole thing, we were convinced, all of us, that the linearity would be the best. And then you go to the site, and I had several locations to decide between them. You know, we were many, and we had to divide the job between many. I would say this site, they say this site is taken by this person, but this other site is fine, and then etc. etc. It was a nice thing to discover the other sites too. And I had 2-3 choices that I kept in between. I went with Ranim and Neville to see the sites. And then I was very pleased with this site that had to go for Manal. Manal is with us, maybe. But she found the slope very strong for her work. And I said, okay, if Manal doesn't take this site, this is my site. Because, you know, the importance of the site that I had to select was that when the car were coming, they see it as silhouette. Corten helps you create the silhouette effect. And I put them in a way that the sand on the dune going up is all the time behind them. I chose a few of the sculpture that will have rocks behind them. So it depends if you are on the car passing there, you will see a caravan just moving around you made of species of flora and fauna. And if you go nearer, you start understanding them in response to the rocks that are around them. So I was very pleased with the site. I found the site. I mean, we defined the site by the tree that was in front. So I said it has to be 2-point-something meter from that tree until the end. And this was because the linearity was 150 meter. And in the office, they sent 150.1, which made everybody crazy about this 0.1 thing. But in fact, this is the preciseness because we're not present all the time. So we have Google, we have, of course, our eyes to have visited the site. And we had concerns to make things kind of perfect so that it looks really nice up to the point of what's needed. Of course, all of us were professionals there. So the site was really something that it took us a full day going around. It's not a small site, you know. You have to walk, go around, go by car, then walk to the site and see how it feels with the work I wanted to do. The rocks behind me were beautiful. I mean, all the rocks are fantastic in that area, but I felt them because mine needed a long stretch. I felt them very nice.
I mean, there really is a mystical element to the desert, and you really see it very strongly in El Ola. I have a million more questions, but I really have to be democratic now and open the floor. So
I'm Lebanese. Come on, I'm Lebanese.
We have to change. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to look through the questions in order, and I think specific people should answer specific questions, because otherwise we won't be able to get through all. So the first question I have from Maysoon Barber, who says it's beautiful. So Reem Sawaf asked about the poem that was written on the anklet. Shireen, maybe you could write that in a chat, because I think that's faster, no? Maysoon asked for how, with the close down, this is an important question. How do you see the future of these works of public art standing against the test of nature? I just need to say one thing. Desert X is ephemeral. It has a certain timeline of a few months regardless. So it's not that it was shut down because of what we're experiencing right now. It ended, I think, end of February, if I'm not mistaken. But there is definitely an issue now with public art. I'm not quite sure how things are going to proceed. I think it's fine if it's big open spaces, but I just think the art world is gonna have to change if we experience different waves of the pandemic. But I don't know if any of the artists want to answer about the future of public works of art. Especially, I'm interested in this from the Saudi perspective, because I know a lot is being done in terms of public sculptures in Riyadh. So maybe if someone can talk about that.
Hi Nadine.
No,
مين يبغى يتكلم؟ أحكي ولا ما أحكي؟
Go ahead.
Definitely during the press conference for this location where we were showing our artworks, that location was actually meant to have a resort built on top of it and completely transformed for tourism. But what happened is that on the opening of Desert X, the director of the Royal Commission of Al Ula announced that this location will be permanently dedicated to public art and the outdoors, basically a rotating sort of exhibition as we had done with Desert X. And this is amazing news for all of us when he made that announcement. More spaces for artworks to be shown, a more interesting place, because you have to travel. There'd be art tourism rather than just a selfie tourism type of thing. As for public art in Saudi, it's going strong. There is public art commissions happening. They are building multiple museums across the country, meaning above 80 museums. And this is in different locations, not just concentrated in Riyadh or Jeddah, but Al Ula is getting, I think, 2 museums, and the Eastern Province too. And so all of these museums in the past, for some reason, you would see that the public or permanent works that are commissioned for the entrances. I'll give you an example of the museum next to my house in Bahran, which is Itra.
Yes.
When they opened up, there is no permanent artworks by Saudi artists that I know of. I believe it was just all international artists, non-Saudis. And thankfully, now this trend has completely been transformed, where I think Saudi artists are getting a lot of commissions and a lot of opportunities to present their artworks in a permanent or public display for their own community.
Thank you, everyone. So on behalf of the Art Circle team, I would like to thank you all for your wonderful input and a wonderful conversation. It was a very interesting to see fascinating to see to have information on insight of your work and the way you responded to the sound. I would like to thank also all our members and friends for the attendance. And before we leave, I would like to invite you all to check and share our website, theartcircle.ae, and for all general information about what our activities, past and future. Thank you very much, everyone. It was wonderful to have you all on board.